Amelia Stories, Chapter 5, Section 1, John McClenney. Frederick McClenney met and married Kachina Toos in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1890. Fred was a second-generation American whose family moved over from Scotland. Kachina was Cherokee, whose family hadn't moved in the Great Migration. Kachina met Fred because she worked in Fred's office as a secretary. By 1891, they had their first child, Charles George. A year later, in 1892, they had their second child, John David McClenney, my maternal genetic grandfather. Sadly, a few weeks after Kachina gave birth, she would die due to complications. Fred was absolutely beside himself when Kachina passed, so he decided that he needed a change, so he moved the family to Pittsburgh. 3 years later, he would marry Amma Toos, Kachina's little sister. They had 2 more children, and eventually they moved the family to Philadelphia for school for the children. Years went by, and all the kids went through high school and eventually graduated. John was the only one that decided to go to college and absolutely hated it. So he tried the trades. Metalworking? Too hot. Plumbing? Nope, covered in shit all day. Woodworking? Much better. So he became a woodworker apprentice. 2 years passed. Walking by the harbor, ships going everywhere, it hit him. He wanted to be on one of those ships. He quit his job and eventually became a deckhand. The work was grueling. The watches were long. But pulling back into port, he was handed a pile of money and he was hooked. After 6 months of life at sea, he realized where the real money was at, being an officer. At the time, the merchant marines had a requirement of 2 years of college and a minimum of 5 years of sea duty to be an officer. John had some college but not enough sea time, and lastly, had no connections to grease the wheels. This was all about to change. Amelia Stories, Chapter 5, Section 2, John McClenney. John had finished a tour on the Winnie P., the merchant marine vessel Winnipesaukee, named after the lake. She was recently reflagged, refitted, and upgraded as a cargo cruiser. John has worked his way up from a deckhand to seaman on the many cargo runs from Boston to here and there. He was taking some time off from the next run when his buddies dragged him out to Worcester, Mass. to a Wednesday night party. The place was filled with artists, singers, musicians, painters, sculptors, poets, writers, and a priest or two. He drank, smoked, and ate the most fabulous roast pig, and went back for seconds, then thirds. It was a huge pig. There was a stage and performances by amazingly talented people. He couldn't play an instrument or sing or anything like that, but he could dance and did. As the night was wearing and the entertainment had left the stage, a chant started. "Amelia, Amelia, Amelia." "Who the hell was Amelia?" he said. He didn't have to wait long, as the svelte, hot, amazingly beautiful woman got up from a table and started belting out a tune on the stage. The young woman, Amelia Bold, my grandmother. Amelia Stories, Chapter 5, Section 3, John McClenney. Amelia, my grandmother, sang her heart out that night, as she would later tell me. She had just gotten an agent who in turn had gotten her an audition in New York City for a new musical. The audition was scheduled for Friday morning in New York City at 10:30 a.m. on the Lower East Side somewhere. However, her agent suggested stopping over at a well-to-do party in Worcester to sing at because of who was going to be there. She agreed and went. When the entertainment walked off the stage that night, everyone started banging the tables for her to sing. She was the darling of the party, and everyone was talking about how she was going to make it. She gathered herself and jumped up on stage. John was in the back, and as she searched the room, their eyes met. She told me it was like a bolt of electricity hit her. She chose one of her favorite songs to sing specifically to him, and with each note, it was like this charge ran between them. She finished to rousing applause. She heard none of it. John was standing there at the edge of the stage to help her down. He touched her hand, and that was it. The connection was complete. She knew this man. Amelia Stories, Chapter 5, Section 4, John McClenney. I asked my grandmother, "Did you sleep with him that night?" She shot me a look like I had asked the stupidest question ever. She told me that she could hardly avoid it, nor did she want to. She was no virgin, and neither was he. While she didn't go into any detail about the experience, all she said was that it was a beautiful night. The next morning, she was supposed to leave for New York City with her agent. John asked if he could come along. He didn't have to be anywhere, and she certainly didn't want to leave him. So they boarded the train together and went down to New York City. 5 hours later, they were at Penn Station, and 2 hours after that, they were in her hotel room. Amelia's audition wasn't until the next morning, so they spent the whole day in New York City together, without a care in the world. As Amelia would later tell me, it was a magical day and night. With each moment, she was falling more and more in love with him. The next day, they got up and went to her audition. John wasn't allowed in, so he went shopping. John found a jewelry store and bought a ring. 4 hours later in Central Park, he was down on one knee asking for Amelia's hand in marriage. Amelia Stories, Chapter 5, Section 5, John McClenney. "You did what?" I yelled. She married John McClenney after knowing him for a single day. I was rapt with attention on her every word. My grandmother calmly replied, "Yeah, I married him." She went on, "I did my audition. I didn't think I did okay, but the agent assured me that I did, and then John and I went for a walk in Central Park." She stopped for a moment, and her voice got very low. I knew, he knew, we just knew, she said, and then she continued. He got down on one knee and asked me right then and there, and I said yes, and that was that. She told me that they went directly to City Hall and got a license. They wanted to get married as quickly as possible. Once that was done, then they found a Protestant preacher. John was Protestant, she wasn't, but it mattered to him. Then, without so much say-so, they got married right there in front of the preacher. The minister's wife was her maid of honor. She told me that she was so happy she was crying, and right then, I saw my grandmother's eyes well up. It got quiet in the room. Amelia didn't speak for a long while. Then, out of nowhere, she volunteered. It was just the gold band, but honestly, I didn't care. I was just so happy to be his, and he was mine. Amelia Stories, Chapter 5, Section 6, John McClenney. As it turned out, my grandmother had actually gotten the part, but it didn't matter anymore as far as she was concerned. Her heart was somewhere else. She turned down the part and then got on the train to Boston to start her new life with her new husband, John McClenney. Naturally, as you might imagine, this shocked everyone around her. Her friends, her manager, her world just turned upside down. John made her feel safe for the first time in her whole life, comfortable, taken care of in a way that no one else ever had. She told me that she had stepped off that train in New York City knowing that she would marry him, and she stepped back on that same train, his wife. She told me, matter-of-factly, we found a place together, used some money that we had saved, and started our new lives as husband and wife. And then she continued. He was trying to get into being an officer on a merchant marine ship, and I was just trying to make a nice home for us. It was weeks later when I missed my moon and I realized I was pregnant. I asked, Richard? She said no. She saw my question and then continued. No, Richard would come along later. This was the first of two that wouldn't survive. Over the next 3 years, they kept trying. In 1928, they succeeded with the birth of my uncle Richard, and again in 1930 with the birth of my mother, Joan. Amelia Stories, Chapter 5, Section 7, John McClenney. They were happy living their lives together, but John was not happy being away from Amelia for long stretches of time. Nor was he happy about the backbreaking work, but he needed to provide for his family. Oddly enough, it would be Amelia that would solve their problems. One of her ex-boyfriends was connected, and she ran in at the market. One thing led to another, and before you knew it, John had himself an interview with a review board, courtesy Amelia's ex-boyfriend. The ex was extremely well connected and got John his interview, squaring away any and all paperwork. In return for the help, John, unbeknownst to Amelia, had to do a few things for his new benefactors. What she found out after John disappeared was that her friend was in the mob, and the mob needed him, and he needed the mob. It was a perfect match, which landed him on the MMV Valley Forge, first as a third officer for a few runs back and forth, and then second, and then finally as first officer. When the stock market crashed in 1928 and people were losing their homes and their livelihoods, my grandparents were doing very well for themselves. And that was mostly due to the fact that the mob was paying him insanely well to smuggle diamonds back and forth into the country. My grandmother got up out of bed, went to a closet, and brought down a box. When she opened the box, it was filled with precious jewels, rings, necklaces, cut and uncut gemstones, rubies, diamonds, emeralds, pearls. There were lots of pearls, big ones. Amelia Stories, Chapter 5, Section 8, John McClenney. In 1927, when John was home, my grandparents tried to get pregnant a few more times and finally succeeded. Richard David McClenney was born on April 3rd, 1928. John had to leave for duty immediately afterwards. However, during May of 1929, when John was home, Amelia caught again, and on February 13th, 1930, Joan Norma McClenney was born, my mother. Amelia started, I wanted for nothing. John saw to that. First made on a merchant marine vessel, paid very well. What I didn't know was just how well it paid. My kids were loved, I had a man that I loved, and I had all that I could ask for. As she put it, the only part that wasn't fun was the fact that John was gone for long months at a time. The wife of a merchant marine was wait and wait and wait, and then wait some more. Then a few weeks together, and then he was off again. But every trip home, he always came through the door with gifts from faraway places. Every time he came home, we'd get reacquainted and settled in, and then we'd go out house shopping. John was insistent on a big house for our family. I didn't want or need a big house. I just wanted a house of my own. I admitted that it was getting a little crowded in the apartment, and as far as I was concerned, all I wanted was the kids to have their own rooms, something John and I never had. Amelia Stories, Chapter 5, Section 9, John McClenney. Daddy! Joni yelled when her papa came through the door. John had come home from another trip to South Africa, and he was barely through the door when his daughter was all over him with kisses, hugs, and stories. She immediately commanded his attention and dragged him into her shared bedroom with her brother Richard. Amelia just stood by the door watching her husband play with her daughter. He had the biggest smile on his face. Later that night, when the kids were asleep and they were laying in bed, he said to her, I missed that. Amelia asked, What? What did you miss? He continued, Joni. That's all I was thinking about for the last 2 months. The watch nights, rough seas, cargo, it didn't matter. That's all I wanted was to come home to Joni and her daddy. It's all I thought about. She asked, Was that all that you thought about? Grandma, I shrieked. What? He'd been gone for 2 months. A girl has needs. She told me that John got up out of bed, went to his duffel, came back to bed to show Amelia what he had. Oh my God, John, it's beautiful. It's huge, she said. It was a smoky diamond about 2 inches long with about an inch wide. Joni's birthday was in a few days, and John wanted her to have it as a pendant for her birthday gift. Amelia Stories, Chapter 5, Section 10, John McClenney. I'm just going to the store to get some milk. I'll be right back, John said. That was the last thing Amelia heard from her husband as he walked out the door. After an hour went by and he didn't come back, she wondered where he was. 2 hours, 3 hours went by. Where was he? She was worried, obviously. Hours turned to the next day and it was clear something had happened to him. Amelia was frantic. She went to the store, to his ship, and of course to the local police. Over the next few days, which turned to weeks and then months, Amelia had to come to the reality that her husband was gone. Just gone. Joni was beside herself, always asking where her daddy was. She was 6 and didn't understand. It would be many years before Amelia got the full story of what had actually happened that night. Something happened between the store and their apartment. The last person to see John alive was a neighbor up the street. She saw John running away from the house and 2 men running after him.